early, and we'll be speaking with you soon. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you and welcome to our Protiviti quarterly economic update. Thank you very much for dialing in so promptly. We'll be starting in around 4 or 5 minutes' time. So still time to get yourself a cup of coffee or tea, and we'll be kicking off very soon. Hello, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining so promptly, and welcome to our Protiviti quarterly economic update with John Ashcroft. We'll be starting in around 2 or 3 minutes' time, so still time to grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and we'll be kicking off very, very soon. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you for joining. We'll be kicking off in about 1 minute, and welcome to our Protiviti quarterly economic update with John Ashcroft. If you're quick, you've still got time to grab yourself a cup of coffee, and we will be kicking off very, very soon. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Protiviti and Robert Half quarterly economic update, part of our Tackling Tomorrow Today series for 2022. My name's Paul Middleton, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues from Protiviti and our sister company, Robert Half. It's great to see you all here, and especially to see some familiar names and faces coming up on the screen. Today, we're talking about the future of our UK economy and our global economy. And I'm sure we won't be struggling for things to talk about in that sense. The first time we spoke with John this year, it was back in March when UK inflation was forecasted to be just over 7%, and UK growth was estimated to be just under 4%. That seems like a world ago, and I think 4 chancellors ago as well. The consumer price index has now risen by almost 10% in the last 12 months. And although the OECD recently said the UK economy would grow by 4.4% this year, they predict we will contract by 0.4% next year, with only Russia's contraction of almost 6% being worse than the UK. So what does this hold for us? When can we expect some better news? What's going to happen to inflation, oil prices, fuel prices, gas prices, grain, interest rates, wages, and what effect will the war in the Ukraine continue to have? How will more rises by the Fed affect us and the global economy? And are we already tumbling into recession, or are we already there? So the session today is about what that means for all of us day to day and the businesses we all work in, as well as looking at things like the markets and probably linked very closely to all our pension pots. So to answer all these questions, but more importantly, all your questions, I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. John Ashcroft. As some of you may remember from his appearances on our collaboration forum and previous versions of this economic forum, John specialises in economics, strategy and financial markets, working with professional firms, large corporates and small medium enterprises. He's the author of The Saturday Economist, his weekly blog published on a website of the same name that some of you may subscribe to, discussing the UK and the world economy. And my team will post a link to that in the chat if you wish to go and have a look. John specialises in viral modelling, and it's this combination of modelling and statistical fueled economics that has resonated with so many of you before. So we thought, given everything that's going on, it's quite timely to bring you an update on John's insights, perspectives, challenges, and normally his dose of optimism that goes with that. John will be presenting his thoughts using some slides. So if you have questions or comments while he's speaking, please just post them in the chat and the teams in the Teams bar as we go. When he's finished, I'll be delighted for you to come off mute, ask John all those difficult questions, and please do that just by putting your hand up using the icon or physically. Put your camera on and show me that you want to ask a question, and I'll come to you. John will speak for around 40 minutes, so we've plenty of time to ask questions after that. And I'd really urge you to get involved. Please ask questions, be bold, let us know your thoughts, as it's infectious. And ultimately, this is your forum, so please guide it wherever you'd like it to go. So with that all done, John, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thanks, Paul, and good morning, everybody. It's certainly a fascinating time, and there's much talk of recession. The Bank of England talking about are being already in recession. The OBR suggesting we're already in recession, but actually there isn't much evidence yet that we're in recession. A lot of evidence that we could be heading that way, and badly. But we'll be looking at some of the issues affecting the UK economy, and we'll also be looking at the world economy, a quick whiz around the world before we focus in some detail on the UK. A lot of information this morning and a lot of heavy data, but if you bear with me, we're hoping to deal with so many critical issues. So thanks for joining me. I'm now going to pull up my shared slide deck with a bit of luck. We had a few issues yesterday, but I'll then run through this slide deck and you can pick up on the points you want to do as we go through. Okay, so hopefully that's my slide deck in play.
No, it's not yet, John. There we go. It's buffering now.
Yeah, no, go come out for a minute. Go, what? Okay, we should be good now.
Not yet, John.
Oh, let's try that again.
You can see your desktop, John.
You see my desktop?
You can see your desktop. You might just be sharing the wrong screen.
Yeah, maybe I'll get back to where I was. Let me try another screen for you.
We'll give it one more go, and if not, Becky, I think if you're able to maybe share from our side if that doesn't work.
Yeah, can do.
But
No,
just
give one more go.
Just let yeah. There we go. That looks more promising. If you get rid of the team slide, there we go.
How's that?
Perfect. You're up and running.
Yeah, sorry about that. A few techie issues. So as I say, we were looking at the world outlook and the UK outlook and the quick market summary to close. So what we're looking at, as we said in the early part of the year, is lower growth with higher inflation, higher interest rates, higher taxes, and higher borrowing. Not a great outlook and not a great recipe for growth. The global recession? Well, not yet, but we're bracing for high prices, lower growth, and higher rates. We've had a series of issues to contend with: the pandemic shock, the economic shock thereafter, the seismic shock of disruption to supply as the economies recovered, and also the threat of war, with the invasion of Ukraine now in full play. We've talked in the past about the bear hug. Putin's move on Ukraine meant that it came up against the NATO forces, Russia's budget of $50 billion up against $1 trillion from NATO and the services there. And that's why there's so much talk now about the Russians actually running out of munitions, that they're begging product from North Korea and around the world, trying to meet this demand on their rapidly depleting resources. So we added global conflict and global tensions to the issue. But when we look at the latest IMF world growth forecasts, we've seen through the year, they've been reducing the prospects for growth. They talked about growth at the start of the year of 4.4% for the UK economy. That slipped to 3.6% in April. It slowed again to 3% in July. And the latest October forecast is slightly better at 3.2%. And we're seeing how that impacts on the different countries around the world. Some good news on the inflation front. We've seen an easing of oil prices, with oil trading at $85 or $86 today. But this is WTI, West Texas International, the prices coming off the top. Equally with gas prices, Gazprom putting the squeeze on Germany and Europe, but they've come off the real highs that we saw earlier in the year, but still historically high compared to a year or so ago. Grain equally, the pressures on grain prices has eased given the passage of product out of the Black Sea to the rest of the world, and equally with copper, some easing of prices there. And we've also seen this rapid decline in shipping costs. The crisis of shipping costs from China to North America has now eased significantly. And there's further good news because new container capacity, more container capacity, is set to come on stream next year. And there's even been some easing of the chip crisis, that Nintendo has been fighting the chip crisis as more capacity has came on stream through the year and more is promised for next year. So what of world trade? We know that in 2021, world trade bounced back with 10% growth. That eased in 2022 to around 4.5% and is set to ease even further next year to about 2.5%. So this pattern of slowing world trade and easing of prices to a certain extent is going to ease the inflation outlook for the world and even for the UK economy into next year. In China, forecasts have been falling. We know that it was around 2021, it grew about 8.1%, and now is expected growth of about 3.2%, which is down from estimates of nearly 5% growth early in the year. China at the moment grappling with the COVID crisis, which is brutal, shocking tactics to try and contain the problems of new outbreaks. And the IMF are warning that China's got to recalibrate this COVID strategy if they're going to see growth at even the levels, the reduced estimates at the present time. Do we still think China will overtake the US as the largest economy in the world by 2030? Well, maybe we're not so sure now. but nevertheless, it's still set to double in size by 2035 and beyond. And we must not forget, as we grapple with the challenges of Great Britain in the world, that the Asia-Pacific zone accounts for 35% growth. And here's a chart. Here's a graph of anybody like geeky stuff like this. This is the US and China now account for half of the world's household wealth. So forget what's happening in the UK or what's happening in Europe. China and the US now account for half of the world's wealth. And that's why we think that the new reserve currency will be the yuan, the renminbi, as it comes to play to challenge the hegemony of the dollar. So what of the USA? Well, here again, we're seeing growth forecasts lowered for this year and into next year, but not into a recessionary environment. And we've seen the unemployment rate quite low at 3.7%, as it is in the UK, and modest expansion of unemployment is expected over the next couple of years. And the inflation rate has hit 8% through this year. We'll look at the monthly charts in just a moment, and it's expected to slow to about 5.5% next year. When we look at the monthly pattern, you'll see why there's so much optimism in the US that the peaks may now have been hit. First of all, in consumer prices, which peaked at 9% in May, slowing to just under 8% in October. And that pattern is repeated in producer prices, which peaked at just under 12% in March, now slowing to 8% in October. So no wonder that markets are optimistic about the direction of travel, and so much speculation about how aggressive we'll have to be in the year ahead, especially into next year. Let's not forget, given the strength of the dollar this year, that the fundamental problems remain: a big internal deficit and also a big trade deficit, no matter what happened to the sanctions with China. So these twin deficit dilemma, internal deficit, external deficit, leads to this phenomenal $31.3 trillion debt and rising. So what of the EU? Well, again, similar pattern in the EU with growth forecasts lowered. And it looks as if the ECB is slightly behind the curve when it comes to inflation, with the indications being that inflation is still set to rise, given the problems with gas specifically, and Gazprom putting the squeeze on Germany and on the European states, that basically growth forecasts may well be lowered, and the Fed will be and the ECB will be expected to act to raise rates even higher. Each week now, we do our Friday forward guidance, we do our Monday morning market review, and a Friday forward guidance. And we think that this is the pattern of the outlook for US base rates over the next year, peaking about 4.75% into next year. And in the UK, we expect base rates to peak at about 4.5% in the middle of 2023. And similarly, in Europe, where they're really behind the curve, and this estimate of 3.5% may well be too low. We know we've seen market expectations of bank rate shot up when Kwasi Kwarteng was hijacked by the markets and possibly the bank and possibly the Treasury when he did his lavish budget. But now estimates have come down to around between 4 and 5%. And this is our summary of forecast at the moment, which is up online on the website, and we update that every week. It's not changing much at the moment. So the big dilemma in the US is the markets are playing the Fed. How aggressive will the Fed be? How have we seen the worst of it? Well, maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm now going to focus on the UK, and bear with me because I've been trying to grapple with everything that's happened. As Paul said, we've had 4 chances in the last 4 or 5 months, and we've had a couple of budget cracks at that. So we're trying to digest what happened with the OBR forecast specifically. Bear in mind, if you're a new chancellor like Kwasi Kwarteng and you come into office saying, you know, you don't rate the Treasury, you don't rate the OBR, you don't rate the markets, you don't rate the bank, then everybody's going to stand back and say, well, have a go, pal, and see how you get on. So we are expecting, and to some extent, if I have my positive outlook to play, we expect growth of 4.4% this year. Not so dramatic, really. Up in the top right, we saw growth of almost 11% in Q1 and 4% in Q2 and 2.4% growth year on year in Q3. Forget all those estimates of, well, don't forget, but put into perspective the estimates that growth was slowing into the third quarter, yes, it was slowing, but the year-on-year comparison was still positive. And also bearing in mind at the moment, because there's been so much drama in the data over the last couple of years, the poor guys who have to do the seasonal adjustments are really struggling because the disparities are so enormous with the pandemic shock and so on. So our benign forecast will be, we see growth of 4.4% this year, which is almost uncontestable now, given the data we've already got. And we think there could be an outcome about 0.5% growth next year. The OBR are much more negative. They see 4.2% this year and shock to output of 1.4% next year. The bank are even more pessimistic. They see almost 2%, 1.9% the shock next year. When we look at the forecast for the UK economy, at this stage, here we're just including the forecast for November from about 15 major forecasters. They see growth well into negative territory, with estimates of inflation next year anything from 2% to 8%. So there's a lot of confusion about it. And when we look at the latest, you hear a lot about the global PMI, S&P global PMI data set. They're really in negative territory at the moment. I'm not so keen on that. It's more like a mood swing index rather than a clear barometer of the direction of travel. Why is everybody so gloomy? Well, it's this incredible squeeze the OBR are talking about to household disposable income, given the squeeze on real wages as inflation is above the level of wage settlements, and also the shock of energy prices, plus some tax rises to feed into the equation. So the OBR is saying that the shock to disposable income could be 7% over the next couple of years. Anyway, makes you wonder why we pay so much attention to the OBR forecast, really. They don't have a great reputation. But when you see the trend growth, this is what the OBR, the yellow line, where the OBR were projecting in March, and this is where they are in November with this shock to output and then a steady recovery, compared to a trend rate of 2.1% prior to COVID. It means the output gap, where we would have been had the world gone to swimming in according to plan, we've lost about 10% of output, which is worth about $200 billion pounds plus. And that means that's a tax take of almost 100 billion, which is now feeding into pressure on government borrowing. So let's see if the OBR forecasts are as pessimistic as the outturns emerge. Maybe not. This could look too dramatic, but it certainly makes an incredible picture of the shock to output. And when we look at things like manufacturing, this is the long run trend since 1948. So there was a bit of a setback in manufacturing at the moment, but as you see, according to trend, big setback in the COVID crisis, then a big recovery, which overshot the trend, and that's adjusting at the moment. And that's feeding into some of the negativity about growth at the moment, which would argue that maybe it won't be quite as bad next year. Inflation, the annual average forecast about 9% for this year and 8.2% next year. So still a big inflationary burden. And when we see it month by month, these are the forecasts from the Bank of England in May, which thought it was going to peak at 10% and then rapidly drop. This is their estimate in November, peaking at 11% and then dropping quite radically next year. And if you look at the OBR figures, they're even more pessimistic, optimistic. They say there's going to be negative deflation, in fact, but into 2024, the end of 2024. And if you believe that, then you believe anything. Certainly, the level of confidence we attach to OBR forecast diminishes by every 12 months added to the plan. Oil prices, we've seen oil prices come off the top. They're trading about 85, 86 at the moment. We expect them to average $95 through to the end of the year. But here's a chart for geeks. That means the inflationary pressure from oil, the red chart at the bottom, diminishes by the end of this year and into the first quarter next year. So still a big problems from gas prices, but oil prices means that the deflationary impact will start to feed through into Q1 and Q2 next year, which is good news for inflation. When we look at the bank base rate forecast, this is our estimate of where we see base rates going, and the OBR is slightly more pessimistic, depending which way you look at it. They see rates peaking at about just under 5% in the third quarter of next year. And that looks to be highly demanding at the moment because the Fed are already signaling they're going to move still going to move higher, but not in jumps of 75 basis points now, which is what we envisaged in the plan. And the Bank of England already getting a bit nervous with even now they haven't got a consensus vote, a full vote for for the rate rises that are being put into place. So again, the OBR looks a bit too negative, if you like, in terms of the monetary outlook for base rates. I'm going to look at the labour market charts at the moment, and I've tried to put in some interesting charts on this thing because it's such a fascinating issue where we have 1.2 million unemployed, incredibly low, and 1.2 million vacancies in the economy. An astonishing phenomena, which we'll look at some of the data for that. So we see at the moment, inflation or unemployment averaging about 3.8% this year, rising under one scenario to 4.2 and 4.4 in numerical terms. That means it's going to rise from about 1.3 million to 1.5 million by 2024. That could well turn out to be a slightly more pessimistic scenario, given the fact that we still have this incredibly high number of vacancies. And when we look at the ratio of the UV ratio, as we call it, from unemployment to vacancies, you'll see it's hit this incredibly low figure, which is starting to pick up. But we still look at the disparity in the numbers. Here's a chart for geeks again. This is an amended beverage curve, forgive me at the moment. The big data set in the middle is actually the trend. And what we've seen is significant outliers generated by COVID, where vacancies were too low in the period May 2020 to December 2020. And now they're just too high compared to the reality of the market is between June 2021 and into September, the latest data at the moment. What we should see is for a given level of unemployment of 1.3 million, the level of vacancies should be more like 800,000 according to the base data. And this suggests that A, there are too many vacancies in the economy given the level of output, but B, also that this may well be a buffer which absorbs some of the unemployment shock as the economy slows down. Which sectors are most affected? Well, it's health and social, accommodation and food, retail, but also in professional services, manufacturing, and significantly still demands in construction. So what we see in terms of earnings at the moment is the red line is the trend rate of growth, about 3.5%. I've seen earnings pop up to 6% or 6.5%, but we still expect that to average about 6% into 2023 and possibly slowing in 2024. The average earnings by quarter gives some of that data that it was peaking around 7.3% in the second quarter, mainly for statistical reasons. I'm not going to look at a series of charts because a lot of talk about where the jobs or what's happened to unemployment. And what we've seen is the employment dropped in 2020 given COVID, but then it picked up significantly to around 32.7 million, according to the latest data we have, which is for Q3 2022. And what we have seen is the incredible drop in self-employment, which was about 5 million prior to COVID, and it's dropped to about 4.5 or 4.3 million in the latest data. So a lot of jobs left in the market were people who were self-employed, who presumably just gave up the growth, but gave up the ghost in terms of working for themselves. But also there's been a rise in economically inactive people, those who've just decided that they're going to call it a day and pack it in. A lot of speculation about immigration. What we see is this is the employment pattern for UK citizens. Bearing in mind, 20% of the workforce is the non-UK citizens. This is what happened to EU citizenship in terms of employment in the UK of EU citizens. It peaked in 2020 prior to COVID, but the trend rate of growth, had that continued, did not come back after COVID. Had the trend rate of growth continued, it would have been 2.7 million compared to what is about 2.2 or even 2.3 at the moment. So almost 500,000 people left the UK to go back to Europe and have not come back. And this has compounded the challenges for recruitment in health and retail and all sorts of sectors. That's why the CBI are arguing for a relaxation of immigration controls. That's why Wolfson, next, who was a great passionate advocate of Brexit, is calling for a relaxation of immigration controls. And what we get is cant from the government talking about the priority is illegal immigration. Yes, it is an issue to be dealt with, but the priority is trying to get these workers back into the jobs that we need in the UK. And what's happened is the non-EU participation rate has just continued on trend. So big challenges there for government. The dogma is divisive because it's preventing this relaxation of rules. And of course, we've got the Labour Party and Starmer arguing that he just wants to see higher wages for the workforce. Okay, but that 500,000 bridge will not be met anytime soon. A look at the autumn statement. Yes, a lot of credit went to Jeremy Hunt for what he was doing, but so much of it was back-end loaded. You know, the pain was pushed back into 24, 25, and actually beyond into the next parliament, which a lot of people talked about. And when we look at the personal tax situation specifically, we can see that is, yeah, sorry, yeah, we see the personal tax burden. It makes you wonder why they place so much pressure on personal taxation increases at this time, creating so many bad points for the Tories and boosting the Labour Party polls, because the reality is it only really comes into yield in 2 or 3 years' time, presumably after the election. Of course, you got credit from the markets because of that. And equally in terms of the public spending, we've seen giveaways to the NHS and to education, but the real burden of the increases comes in 25, 26 onward. This asterisk is what we call cuts as yet to be identified. It was a tactic that David Stockman, the budget director of Ronald Reagan, used during his budget calculations. They couldn't balance the figures, so they just put in an asterisk and said, well, you know, these cuts we'll identify a bit later down the line. So it's going to be left to possibly the Labour Party to sort out how those deficits or cuts in government spending are made. And when we see the forecast in business taxes, and then they start to bite slightly into next year, but bites into 24, 25. This is for the windfall tax, the energy profits level, and the business tax. And what we've seen is this mythology of Britain becoming the Singapore of Europe is just we've seen this slide before from me. It's just that fantasy island for the Treasury.
And the party opposite, we have a plan.
Yeah, I'm not sure he has a plan at the moment, which we'll talk about later. But when we look at borrowing, it was estimated to be borrowing of 99, but it's on trend until after the September figures. But this has been blown away by interest payments that have been coming into play. And we're seeing the estimates for borrowing drop from 99 billion was expected this year to a phenomenal 177 billion and 140 billion, then 84, then 77, then 80. A phenomenal increase in government borrowing and the demands on the gilt market. Why has that happened? It's happened because of the differences in the debt interest spending, but also the energy and cost of living support, which was 58 billion this year and 25 billion next year. So a big surge in borrowing, primarily because of the debt interest spending. Where's that come from? And also the energy and cost of living support. And when we look at the forecast for borrowing, as I say, it goes to quite a phenomenal rise for this year and into next. And when we look at public sector debt, that rises to about 2.8 trillion, say quickly by 24, 25, which I've not seen the figures talked about, but that accounts to something like 107% or 106% in those couple of years as a percentage of GDP. Why did Kwasi Kwarteng get into trouble? Well, as I say, he came in challenging Treasury thinking, came in challenging the Bank of England's mandate, and disregard for the market, ignored the OBR, paid scant regard to the gilt market, and he was punished because the bank now owns a third of the gilts. They stood back and let it happen a little bit. Overseas holdings, that's now just under 30% of the gilt market. They didn't like the trend of where it was all going. So when we look at the summary from the IFS, they say it's a worse public finance outlook. Yes, we agree with that. Tax as a share of national income is forecast to increase above 37% as a result of the latest Treasury plan. Debt interest is now at its highest share of GDP in over 70 years, and debt is barely falling or barely on the falling path at all. And although we're squeezing, haven't got the credit for squeezing the figures. Actually, as the IFS says, it's Lord make me squeeze public service budgets, but not just yet. It's pushed into the Labour Party's lap, probably. the Conservative Party lap, possibly after the next election. So now we look at what of trade. This is the chart of where we think the deficit will be this year. Surplus in services maintained, top right corner, but the deficit trading goods goes from 150 billion this year to over 230 billion in 2022. And that means the net trade deficit is about 80 billion this year. And when we look at what's happening in trade, well, the deficit trading goods is increasing with both in terms of the EU and with the non-EU, and the deficits overall means that the trade balance looks bad as imports surge in, and the UK exports are still lagging in terms of the way they go. So a lot of ground we covered. I'm sure you've all got a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions to try and grapple with it. So it took me quite some time to try to understand what was being said and what was actually happening, and also what was being interpreted by the markets. So I'm just going to wrap up now with a look at the market updates. A lot of questions about what's been happening to the UK markets. Well, we do our Monday morning market evaluation, and this is like a trend momentum analysis that we do. We reckon that the US market specifically were nearly 30% overvalued at the start of the year in January. So it was expected that there'd be, and the European markets not so much, maybe FTSE at 5 and the DAX at 9 in terms of overvaluation, but Nikkei and the Asian markets were around, apart from Shanghai, around 10%. But this setback to the US markets was going to happen, and what we've seen is they've come off by, take the Nasdaq by 34%, Europe, especially France and Germany, down by almost 20%, and the Asian markets down about 10% on average. So they were overvalued. There was going to be a correction. There was a correction. It was a big correction. And where do we see it now? Well, bearing in mind, we see that the Dow is overvalued maybe a little bit, but great value, apparently. I'm not licensed for giving financial advice, and this data is available on the website. But the Nasdaq is undervalued at the moment, we reckon, and Hang Seng specifically, and Shanghai equally. Those are the opportunity markets if you got the courage to beg against COVID and the changing policy of the Chinese government. That's the summary chart. We have it on the website. We look at the markets every week. The pound trading at 119 when we did this. It's actually trading at 120, pushing 121 this morning. Against the euro, it's pushing 116 this morning. And the euro US dollar will be up by 104. So we reckon that we've seen the trough in sterling, and we've probably seen the peak in the dollar. And when we look at gilts, well, the gilt market was trading even lower. 10-year gilts down about 3% in the UK. So a big collapse, big adjustment to the UK gilt market from the days of quasi-Kwarteng, and that shock to pension funds. We all discovered new technology. I'm not sure we knew what LDIs were a couple of months ago, but the shock to pension funds from LDIs has evaporated as gilt yields have reduced. And when we come to Sunak's dilemma, you've got to say there's no tax strategy at the moment, an underlying tax strategy as to what's going on. There's no industrial strategy, which the CBI are complaining about. There's certainly no growth strategy, which is also what they've been talking about. There's no trade strategy. There's no immigration strategy, and there's no Northern Ireland strategy. And given the prospect of the Scottish separation, then the problems could even get worse. So that's my summary. So in summary, as I say, UK recession, well, not yet, but we are braced for higher prices, lower growth, higher rates, and maybe we will be slipping, but it could be relatively modest setback for next year. So that's it. I'll now stop presenting, as I say, and come back to the reality. Hope you're still with me. Hope you're still with me.
Absolutely, John. We all are. We all are. Now, look, thank you ever so much for that. You covered an awful lot of ground there, John. I'll let you take a breath. A lot of graphs and stats and insights as ever, but I think probably more than normal. Quite a few questions. Oh, sorry, quite a few comments in the chat about kind of loving your visuals and things like that. And so, we have posted again, there's the link to John's website in the chat where you can see more of those. I think one of these days, John, we should do a test at the end of this presentation to see if people have actually been listening or not. But before you all dial off, I won't do that today. Don't worry, we'll take it easy. What I would all ask you to do, please, and I can see that they're coming through. Please do put your thoughts and comments in the chat, and we've got a few there already. I'll kick us off with a question, John, and then I'll come to some of the ones we've had. John, you've got a wide range of people from different industries, different sectors, different businesses, different levels on this call. If you were sat in front of a CEO of a UK PLC this afternoon, with such a wide range of variables you're talking about, and they're asking you what their outlook looks like and what they should be most worried about from a UK perspective, what top 3 things would you point them towards?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I think it's difficult to even pick out 3 because the major challenges at the moment have still got to be coping with the supply shock and coping with the challenges of rising prices. The extent of product elasticity and the extent to which those can be passed on is obviously critical. So from a supply and pricing point of view, that is one issue. A lot of challenges about recruitment and retention, understanding the motivation of the workforce, especially the younger workforce. So understanding what should be there in terms of, you can't adopt the Musk model. Maybe everybody should adopt the Musk model of just firing everybody and asking them to come in the office and explain what they're doing. That doesn't really work. Not sure it works in the US, not going to work at Twitter, and it wouldn't work in the UK. But supply side issues, pricing issues, staffing issues, the challenge of recruitment. We would always go what we call condition red at this time, which would be, you put a hold on recruitment, put a hold on replacement, you put a hold on capital expenditure. We went through a phase where we stopped any maintenance, including painting and decorating the offices. So it'd be all about taking caution because it's understanding where interest rate levels are going to go, and everybody should be modeling the impact of 4.5% interest rates, base rates, with premiums on top of that in terms of what it will happen. So we used to talk a lot about Planet ZERP when it comes to interest rate policy. What we've seen is return to what we would call normality, with gilt yields should be about 4 to 4.5%, and base rates should be about 4 to 4.5%. Whether they'll get there and whether they'll stay there is one thing, but that should be modelled into every business at the moment.
Okay, thank you, John. Just linked to that, you highlighted that the UK has lost 10% of output on that kind of straight line trajectory. Moody's have downgraded us. A lot of people here might feel that the UK is feared so much worse than other countries. Why is that? And how does the UK maintain its place on the world stage?
Well, I'm afraid you have to return to the dreaded issue of Brexit. When we talked about Brexit, we talked about 4 main areas of concern. One was political, one was social, one was economic, and one was business. And in terms of economic and business, we said, well, put those 2 inside because there is no evidence whatsoever to justify a Brexit move with a separation from Europe. That would be damaging to the economy and it would be damaging to business. When it came to social, the issue was immigration. The population had been hyped up about immigration, and there we've seen the problems now that are facing the economy with the severe 1.2 million vacancies, 500,000 people who should be here from the EU or not. So the argument about immigration, the social argument, completely fallacious as it was presented at that time. And then you can find the residual argument. The argument was, who governs Britain? Is it anonymous bureaucrats in Brussels or posh-speaking Cockney rhyming slang for people in the UK? That who governs Britain? That's a great question. So Brexit, I'm afraid, in terms of economics, in terms of political, in terms of social, in terms of business, that's caused incredible damage, which should be so difficult to unwind. And when you see the strength of the Chinese and the US economy, when you see that 35% significance of the Asian gap, when you see the opportunities presented by staying within Europe, when you see the problems created by moving out of Europe with the Japanese car manufacturers, the EV plants going to Europe, then you'll see that's creating fundamental problems for the economy. And we've seen such a significant shock to output. So I'm afraid it's going to be a long grind, given the stance we have at the moment. So no march of the makers. If the government do develop an industrial strategy, as Jeremy Hunt was promising, that will actually be the 9th industrial strategy platform in 12 years. And it shows the lack of see-through thinking in government at the present time. So yeah, sorry to do the Brexit stuff, but you can't get away from it now.
No, No, that's all good. Look, thank you for the questions coming through. I'll start rattling through them, but please also feel free to put your hand up if you want to ask a question to John directly. John, just linked to what you were saying there about the role of the government. Just a question from Chris around that. To what extent can the government, the central bank, influence the macroeconomy, such as reducing unemployment, inflation, promoting economic growth? To what extent is it in our hands?
Well, the role of the central bank is quite clear. Their mandate is an inflation target of about 2%, and that's got to be the overriding objective, and that's got to be a good objective. So the bank must do what it must do to ensure that target is met, and the evidence that they've been significantly lacking behind the curve in getting interest rates moving. Okay, it's easy to say when you're not on the committee, but that's the bank's remit. That's what they should do and get on with it. In terms of government, well, there's so much that has to be done, but it's when you get policy ruled by, you got to kick out the dogma. And if the CBI are calling for lax immigration, then okay, let's relax immigration rules and get more workers into the UK. If the government, as part of the dogma, is saying we must abolish red tape from Europe, and businesses saying, look, it's not regulation, it's standardization of the products and the product standards. We don't want to see this burning of European rules. Well, you've got to kick out the dogma and be pragmatic and get talking with business and get understanding what is really required in terms of a platform for strategy. And there's so many problems they're created with healthcare and in education and in social welfare that they've got to get back to the basics. It's not difficult, but the dogma's got to go, and the right-wing dogma's got to go. And that's got to be a fundamental. You've got to be pragmatic and talk to business and construct the path for growth. There's no strategy for growth at the moment.
So I love this next question from Kelvin. John, you're Prime Minister and Chancellor for the day. What an honour. And maybe just a day. You can maybe last 7 weeks or whatever, but what do you plan for the next year? It's in your hands.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, really, there's so much that. I was once on a panel at the conference in Manchester, and the question on the floor is, when will you be our Prime Minister? And there's great amusement at that, but that's never going to happen. I think the agenda at the moment is horrendous, because if you had presidential control and direct authority, then maybe you could do something. But at the moment, the Tory party is riven with factions. You've got ERG, and you've got the hard Brexiteers, and you've got those who really the commitment to welfare, for example. There are so many issues which will not be addressed. When we talk about, for example, levelling up agenda, we have to accept that in terms of levelling up, the child poverty rate is 40% in Rochdale and it's 4% in Richmond. You tell me a strategy that's going to address that problem. And until we start to look at the issue of child poverty, then we won't understand how child poverty feeds into lax education, means lower industrial economic growth. It feeds into healthcare issues, which adds to the burden on the health service. It feeds to drug abuse, it feeds to alcohol abuse. So attacking child poverty is so fundamental, but we've seen nothing in government stance for 5 or 6 years now, even getting to grips with the problem of child poverty. So, the issues are enormous and the problems of execution are even greater. So I wouldn't take up that mantle specifically, I'm afraid, at the moment.
Okay. It's interesting to hear you talk about those things. One thing you didn't mention there was intervention. And maybe before we get on to one of the questions are kind of looking around about what businesses can do to help buffer themselves. Just a question asked by Schaffner, and do you think the support measures that we've seen by the government are actually helping? Are they lip service? Are they just delaying the pain? That wasn't in your prime ministerial speech. So what do you think?
Well, when you look at what happened with COVID, it was outstanding the way the government did step in terms of the shutdown in the economy, but also the introduction of the furlough scheme. Because had that not been put in place, then the unemployment levels would have been horrendous. I mean, they would have been really difficult. Okay, they may well have recovered, but nevertheless, the government to step in with the furlough scheme was quite significant. No, we had the energy crisis, and the government stepped in to support in terms of the energy situation with this 40, 50 billion, 60 billion spend to support household prices. But that kind of stuff can't go on to forever. Or can it? Maybe it can. But I think some of the intervention schemes are really petty and small scale. So it looks like we're going to lose the opportunity for electric vehicles. And also that's why, a British vote is going to run into trouble, because that gamble won't pay off. But when you take away the rationale for basing in the UK for the car industry specifically, with no clear access to Europe, why would the Japanese, for example, invest in the UK when they can equally invest in Europe and have direct access to the markets? So I think that, intervention, small scale intervention, the government should address the issues of, the fundamentals of education, healthcare, but also infrastructure spending on rail and on road, and on flood defences and on new energy sources. That's where the money should be going, not small scale intervention to say about one plant here or another plant there.
Okay.
Very opinionated this morning, aren't I? Very opinionated. I don't know what's going on. I'm forgetting many years.
Don't worry, we're used to that. You also didn't mention about more borrowing. You've mentioned about kind of Sunak's $1 trillion banknote before. Truss and the question from Tony around Truss and Kwarteng, didn't find a money tree but got a money forest and got hammered by the markets. Do you think that means the era of limitless government borrowing is over? And what impact is that going to have?
Well, I think that, as I was saying, with Truss and Kwarteng, they came into office with a radical agenda and didn't pave the way, no sounding path. But it also, as I say, they'd suggested the Bank of England remit was going to be changed, that they weren't happy with financial regulation in the markets. They didn't need the role of the OBR for the forecast to support the forecast growth, weren't happy with the City of London. So if you come in with all that stance and you present an aggressive agenda that hasn't been really thought through or sold to even their own backbenchers, then you're going to run into trouble. And the cynics would argue that basically the bank stood back and the foreign investors stood back and let it happen. And the bank were embarking on this process of quantitative tightening, as we now call it, just as more demands were being placed on the markets. So yeah, that was a problem of their own making. And I think they were hijacked as they wandered into the jungle, saying that they weren't happy with the performance of the wild animals that got them into real trouble. So here, now you have a situation where the bank are embarking on QT. Why now? It can't be possible to do that because the demands on the gilt issuance is going to be so great this year and next year and for the years ahead. There's a lot of capacity for absorption internationally with the gilt market. So we've seen that investment going on in the US, and equally it will continue in the UK. So there's not an end of an era. There may be a reversion to normality of 4.5% gilt rates, but even that looks like it's going to be some way ahead at the moment as the market's reversing to about 3% growth. So no, there were no change in the issuance issues, but the bank won't be able to dump the gilts that they've got at the moment. And I think the QT is going to be slackened over the next couple of months.
Okay. Well, look, you've given us your CEO message at the start. You've given us your Prime Ministerial and Chancellor speech.
Yes.
Just going back to one of the first questions I think asked by Michelle, what are the key things then that businesses can do to ease their way through the next year? And then linked to that, what is it that consumers can do?
Well, from a business point of view, it's tough. It's always tough when things are really great. I remember in the late 80s, 88, 89, we thought, wow, this is fantastic. You saw the number of Jaguars increasing in the village in which I lived at the time, and business was just great. It was there to be enjoyed. But it was a short-filled fantasy, because the reality is for most businesses, it's a tough grind to get through so many challenges that have to be faced. So you've got to do your scenario planning, and you've got to do your outlook for growth. Could be maybe 1.5% down next year, or it could be 0.5% up, and all that can mean. For most businesses, that doesn't mean a great deal in terms of impact. If revenues fall by 1 or 2%, it's not, you can easily absorb that. But it's a question of having that scenario plan as what could happen to demand and the top sales line level, but also what's happening to the cost curve, and also what's happening to interest rates. So you really got to model your interest rate scenarios, which incidentally the pension fund market did not do with their LDI strategy. So yeah, scenario modeling, examining the cost curve, make sure you're repricing, you have to reprice, make sure you've got your labour strategy in place, and fundamentally look at your gearing and interest rate modeling. And also the problem is, as we see with government, when the top line drops, so often the cost line carries on increasing. And that's why we're seeing a radical adjustment in headcount levels in the tech sector at the moment in the US, not just in Twitter, but in Amazon, Google, and even Apple. So yeah, it's always going to be tough in business. But you've got to do scenario modelings, examine your cost curve, look at your labour strategy, and overall look at your gearing and fundamental challenges of higher rates, which could be here to stay. For households, well, it's going to be difficult because the challenges of energy prices specifically, and this issue of eat or heat is going to be so critical, and the risk of unemployment also looms larger than it has done for a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, on reflection, you normally shower us with a little bit more optimism than that. But you know, one of the optics, and just picking up on a question asked by Steve, is that some of the data you presented shows that maybe EU trends, particularly EU inflation, maybe UK inflation, we're lagging the US by about 6 months. Do you see that? Should we be looking to the US or other markets as that indicator of where we're trending, or are we just out of kilter in the UK?
No, I think it's always a good pattern to look at what's happening in the US because geographically the UK sits between Europe and the US, and if you look at look at sterling, don't think of sterling as being a prime mover. It's really embroiled in that trilogy of the balance between what's happening, especially with the dollar and also with the Europe. But in terms of interest rate policy, yeah, the markets are watching closely what happens with the Fed, and in terms of interestingly, the unemployment levels, the vacancy levels, challenges of recruitment, exactly the same in the US at the moment as they are in the UK. So we can learn a lot by watching the US without being carried away as it being a clear predictor. But there's so much happening in the US that is the same problems in the UK. And fundamentally, you look at the world macroeconomic view, that Russia may have dropped out the top 10 economies in the world, but the UK is still buzzing along there between 6th and 8th place. But it has no place to be on its own. It really would be extremely difficult to find those new mythical markets behind the magic wardrobe in Snow White's Wonderland. Oh, I got my fairy tales mixed up. I
think so. But in terms of us navigating that, navigating that path to the UK, Stephen highlights a point, just saying, well, are we pulling in different directions? So is the current independence of the Bank of England and its remit to maintain 2% inflation, is that counterintuitive to grow the economy? Is there a tension there that we just won't be able to fix without some kind of jolt somewhere? Are they pulling in different directions?
Well, I think the bank has a target of 2%, but it's pretty, it's pretty benign in getting there. So if you look at the 70s and the 80s, what happened in the 70s, inflation averaged about 10% and base rates were 5%. And then what we found is by the time you got into the second decade, inflation was around 10%, but base rates were averaging 10%. They had to adjust. So you've got currently inflation at 11% in the UK and base rates at 3%. That's not being overly aggressive to deal with the issue in everything that's still behind the curve. So I think the bank gets a lot of criticism, but they were in this magical world on planet ZERP where rates were brought down to zero and even talk of negative rates. What nonsense was that? Now we're seeing a reversion to reality for markets, in terms of gilt markets, and for central bank interest rate levels and fiscal policy, monetary policy. So this is a return to normality. We shouldn't really worry about that. It's there to be well understood and well accepted. So the bank, get criticism, but their remit still stands, and they wouldn't go too aggressively even into next year, according to the outlook at the moment. The real challenge is for government to get its house in order. I think when you're into this stage of a Conservative administration where so many people have been in office and out of office, that you're not left with the pick of the crop now to choose from for your ministers. Sorry about that.
Right, no, John, that makes a lot of sense. Quite a few more questions coming through here, so I'm just going to do what I can just to get them to you. Housing, first of all, that's one of the topics you maybe didn't touch on as much. There's been a lot of speculation around that, a lot of speculation around collapsing in the housing market. Do you see that happening? Do you see that coming?
I can't see it coming on the scale that, with the headlines are there to 20 and 25% plus, which when you look at the small print in the forecast says, in the worst case scenario, if the world were to come to an end and the economy dropped by 10%, then it could be that house prices drop by 25. The fundamentals of the market are shortage of supply, increasing demand, but there are issues of leverage in terms of, especially with the cost of mortgages rising as they are doing at the moment. So I think JL came up with a set of forecasts which was suggesting the average prices could drop by about 5% next year, but they're coming off quite significant highs anyway. But thereafter, it will kick back into the year after into 2024 and 25. So yeah, there's going to be some easing in the market because a lot of pain, especially I think the bank estimate there's like 700,000 mortgages coming off fixed rates each quarter through next year. And that's going to be a big shock, which means that, there is a big adjustment to being made for a lot of households. So yeah, some slowing in demand, some slowing in house prices, but no big setback. And over the medium term, they'll still be looking good.
So no collapse. That's probably a relief to most people here. Couple of questions around kind of digitization. One of the risks that we've called out in our own Protiviti top risk surveys around the risk of digitization, the impact that has on businesses. Kelvin's asking a question around, do robots and automation trump a relaxation in migration when seeking to increase productivity? And indeed, what's that, I guess, linked to that, what's that long-term impact, do you think, of the increased desire to digitize and to automate?
Well, you can't get away from the process of digitization and the growth of cloud and so on. So that's got to be continuing. Robotization is happening at pace, especially into things of distribution in terms of manufacturing. That's already been happening. Talk of putting robot cleaners into the NHS, that looks to be a bit more speculative and doesn't quite promise to yield the same results. But there will be inevitable digitization, move to cloud, increasing automation, robotization, AI. We're not even touched on AI, where big progress in terms of artificial intelligence. So yeah, these are all critical trends, but a lot of the basic stuff, the robots picking fruit or the robots dealing with patients, that's going to be far more difficult. So big demand for labour will still be required, increased levels of immigration. And forget productivity. I think productivity is an output number. You have the sort of growth divided by, so output Y, as we call it, divided by L labour equals P productivity. Productivity is not a driver. It's a simple output of the arithmetic of output and labour intention. So, increasing productivity we'll see as we get higher growth. And at the moment, there's no strategy for growth.
Okay. I'm going to test you now from one other particular market sector. Question from Steve around the IT security market to finish us off. Whether you have a view on this, his experience has shown the last 12 months that threats often increase in climates like this. So kind of cyber risk, resilience risk, which in turn creates some resiliency in his particular sector. Do you have data around this? Do you see businesses collapsing? Do you see, what's your view around, the impact of IT security and the threat to the market for things like that?
Well, I think we don't have a lot of data on it, but what we do know is that the sophistication is increasing in terms of the hackers and the fraudsters. So we've got to be ever more vigilant. And I think, you've got to, in my case, I have 3 levels of email. So for different circumstances. So I have a high level for involving monetary issues, a mid-level for private issues I want to keep private, and the rest is at risk of junk. So you've got to be more vigilant. And we hear scams so often about, the letters coming in from a guy in Nigeria, this incredible opportunity, but on a broader scale, challenges to business from fraud and so on. It's got to be boom time for security guys, because the level of fraud and sophistication of fraud is just increasing at an incredible rate.
Absolutely. John, that takes us to the top of the hour. I'm very, very sorry if I didn't get to your question. I think I got to most of them. But look, if you like what you've heard from John today, please contact us at Protiviti and Robert Half. We'll be delighted to carry on the discussion. John, Thank you so much. You covered so much ground there, and there's so many comments in the chat saying people very much like what they see, and the charts that have gone with that. If you like that, you can see more of that on John's website, the Saturday Economist, and all the regular updates he's mentioned. There'll be a video of our forum posted today on our website, so please feel free to share that with your friends and LinkedIn contacts. I hope that's been valuable to you all. It seems so very timely to be doing this, and we will continue to do them, as I'm sure there's more economic turmoil to come. Thank you so much. On behalf of my Protiviti and Roberts Half team here, we extend all our best wishes to you. Stay safe, be bold, be kind to each other, and we look forward to catching up with you again all very soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Very good.